A woman traveled halfway across the country for a man who never existed. No name, no record, no trace, only a stolen address, and 4 letters so carefully written they felt like a promise. When Isabella Carter stepped off that stagecoach in Wyoming, the man waiting at the gate had never heard the name Benjamin Hale in his life. No husband, no home, no way back. Just a stranger's ranch, a silent widower, and a little girl watching from the yard like she'd been waiting for someone she didn't know how to ask for. What Isabella didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that the lie that brought her here was the only thing that could have led her to the truth. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled away before Isabella Carter had finished stepping down. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the dust, not the wind cutting across the open land, not the silence so thick it pressed against her ears. It was the wheels, already turning, already leaving. The driver had not waited for her to find her footing on the uneven ground, had not said a word beyond a clipped stone creek before flicking the reins and moving on, as if she were a parcel he'd been relieved to drop. She stood there with her travel bag in both hands, the leather worn thin at the handles from the weeks of being gripped, set down, lifted again across rail depots and muddy roads, and 3 different coaches since Kansas. The strap of her smaller bag bit into her shoulder. Her boots, which had been adequate for the streets of Wichita, had not been built for whatever this ground was. Hard-packed dirt mixed with something else, something that shifted underfoot like the land itself hadn't decided what it wanted to be. Wyoming, she thought. This is Wyoming. The gate in front of her was a simple thing. 2 posts driven into the earth, a crossbeam overhead with letters burned into the wood. Stone Creek Ranch. The fence ran in both directions from the post, split rail, weathered gray, stretching out until it vanished into the pale distance on either side. Beyond the gate, a dirt road curved toward a cluster of buildings she could just make out. A main house, what looked like a barn, a smaller structure off to the side. The land around them was enormous. That was the only word for it. The sky was bigger than anything she'd seen in Kansas, and Kansas had never seemed small to her before. She had the letters in her coat pocket. She'd put them there that morning before the coach stopped, because she'd wanted to have them close when she arrived. Not to read, she had memorized every line, but because they were the proof. The evidence that this was real, that she was expected, that there was a man named Benjamin Hale waiting somewhere past that gate who had written to her in careful, deliberate sentences about the land he owned and the life he was offering. "I am not a man of poetry," he had written in the second letter, "but I am a man who means what he says. You would have a home here, a real one." She'd read that sentence so many times that the paper had gone soft along the fold. Isabella squared her shoulders, picked up her bag, and walked through the gate. She was about 40 feet down the road when she heard boots on hard ground behind her, and she turned. The man coming from the direction of the barn was not old, not young, somewhere in the difficult middle that hard work tends to create. Lean in the way of someone who doesn't eat enough at regular hours, with hands that even at this distance looked like they'd been used against rough things for a long time. He wore a dun-colored work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and his hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he'd been in the middle of something when he saw her. He stopped about 10 feet away. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected. Not rude, exactly, but not welcoming either. "Help you," he said. "I'm looking for Benjamin Hale," Isabella said. She kept her voice level. She'd practiced this. She'd imagined this moment 100 times on the coach, the meeting, the first exchange. "My name is Isabella Carter. I've come from Wichita. We had a correspondence." The man's expression didn't change, exactly, but something shifted behind it. "Benjamin Hale," he repeated. "Yes, he owns this ranch, Stone Creek Ranch." She gestured back at the gate, as if the name on the crossbeam might clarify things. "I was given this address. I have his letters." The man took his hat off. He ran a hand through his hair, brown going gray at the temples, and then he put the hat back on and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not confusion, something closer to concern. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I don't know who Benjamin Hale is." Isabella's grip tightened on the bag. "I beg your pardon?" I said I don't know that name. He wasn't being unkind. That was almost worse. I'm Cole Mercer. I own Stone Creek Ranch. Have for 11 years. Before me, it was my father's. I've never heard the name Benjamin Hale in my life. The wind came through then, cold and steady, and Isabella became very aware of how far the stagecoach had already gone. That's not possible, she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. I'm not arguing with you, Cole said. I'm just telling you the truth. But she showed him the letters. They stood just inside the barn door because the wind had picked up, and neither of them had suggested going inside the house. That felt too settled, too certain, for a situation that was neither. Cole held the letters carefully, reading without rushing, and Isabella watched his face for anything that might indicate recognition. There was none. He read all 4 letters, handed them back to her, and stood for a moment with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. The address is this ranch, he said. Yes, but the name is not yours, Isabella said. I know. How long were you corresponding with this man? 4 months. 4 months of letters. 4 months of slowly, carefully, practically deciding that this was rational and possible and worth the risk of crossing half a country to marry a stranger. He wrote about the land, the work. He was very specific about what the life would be, about what he was offering. Cole was quiet for a moment. And you came alone? There's no one to come with, she said. It wasn't self-pity, it was just accurate. Her mother had died 2 years ago. Her father before that. The house in Wichita had been sold to cover debts she hadn't known existed until she was standing in a lawyer's office listening to numbers that made no sense. I made a practical decision. He seemed like a practical man. You made a decision based on letters from someone who doesn't exist, Cole said. That appears to be the case, Isabella said, and she was proud of how steady she kept it. Cole looked out through the barn door at the road, as if the stagecoach might still be visible. It wasn't. The next coach through here isn't until Thursday. It was Monday. I see, Isabella said. I've got a spare room off the kitchen. He said it like he was negotiating terms. It's nothing fancy, small, but it's got a door that latches and a window. You'd have privacy. Thursday you can take the coach to Cedar Bluff, and from there you can wire wherever you need to wire. Wire who? She said, not bitterly. She genuinely didn't know. Cole didn't have an answer for that. He picked up whatever tool he'd been holding when she arrived. She saw now it was a mended length of harness leather, and turned back toward the interior of the barn. I'll have one of the hands bring in water for washing. Supper's at 6. He walked away, and Isabella stood at the barn door looking out at the enormous sky and thought about 4 months of letters and a man named Benjamin Hale and the very specific weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be and entirely in the wrong place all at once. The room was exactly as described. Small, plain, with a narrow bed against one wall and a window that looked out onto the side yard, where a few chickens moved through the dirt with the self-important urgency chickens always seem to have. There was a washstand with a ceramic basin, and someone had left a folded towel on the bed. That was it. Isabella sat on the edge of the mattress, which was firm and not unpleasant, and allowed herself 2 minutes to feel the full weight of the situation before she made herself stop. She had $10.40. She had the clothes in her bag and the letters in her pocket. She had no family and no address to wire, and no one in Wichita who would have noticed she was gone past last week. She had her hands and the things they knew how to do, which included cooking and mending and cleaning and keeping accounts, because her father had made her learn the books when she was 12, and she'd been grateful for it ever since. She was 26 years old, which was old enough to know that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, and young enough that some small part of her still wanted to have it anyway. She folded her extra dress. She placed her mother's hairbrush on the washstand. She hung her coat on the single hook behind the door. Then she went to find the kitchen, because supper didn't make itself. The kitchen was at the back of the house, larger than she'd expected, with a cast-iron stove that had seen serious use and a wooden table long enough for 8 people that currently held only 3 places set, badly, by someone who'd clearly done it in a hurry. There was a pot of something on the stove that smelled like it had been simmering since morning. Beans, she thought. and salt pork, and not much else. She was checking the pot when she heard the sound. It was soft, coming from the hallway. She turned and found a child standing in the kitchen doorway. The girl was maybe 7 or 8, small for her age, or perhaps just made to seem that way by how carefully she was holding herself. Shoulders drawn in, weight shifted slightly back, like she'd trained herself to take up less space than she occupied. Her hair was dark brown and had been braided sometime that morning by hands that weren't especially practiced at it, the plait unraveling near the bottom. She wore a dress that was clean but slightly too short, the hem sitting above her ankles in the way of a child who'd grown faster than anyone had kept track of. She stared at Isabella with her father's directness, that same measuring look, as if she were doing arithmetic, but with something underneath it that Cole didn't have, something careful and waiting. "You the lady from the stagecoach," the girl said. It wasn't quite a question. "I am," Isabella said. "My name is Isabella Carter. What's yours?" "Maisie Mercer." A pause. "My pa said a lady was here but that she was going to leave Thursday." "That's the plan," Isabella said. Maisie looked at the stove. "Are you making supper?" "I was thinking about it. Hetty usually makes supper, but she went home sick yesterday and Pa doesn't cook very good." She said this without embarrassment, as plain as weather. "Last night we had bread and cold beans." "I see," Isabella said. "Do you know where the flour is kept?" Maisie knew where everything was kept. That became apparent in the next 10 minutes as she directed Isabella through the kitchen with the confident authority of someone who had spent considerable time in this room, observing and remembering without ever being the one doing. The flour was in the second cabinet from the left. The salt was on the shelf above the stove. There were eggs from the morning still in a basket by the back door. There was dried sage hanging from a hook she hadn't noticed near the window. "Can you make biscuits?" Maisie asked. "I can make biscuits," Isabella said. "My mother made good biscuits." She said it matter-of-factly, no particular inflection. "She died when I was 4. I don't remember a lot, just some things." Isabella kept her hands moving in the flour. "What do you remember?" Maisie thought about it with the seriousness of someone giving the question its proper weight. "Her hands," she said finally. "They were smaller than Pa's, but they were always warm." Isabella didn't say anything for a moment. She turned the dough onto the board and pressed into it steadily. "That's a good thing to remember," she said. Cole came in at 6 o'clock with 2 ranch hands, a wiry older man named Deacon, who spoke in half sentences and seemed to find everything mildly amusing, and a younger one named Pete, who was maybe 20, broad-shouldered, and ate with the focused attention of someone who'd spent time not having enough. Neither of them acknowledged Isabella's presence in any way that could be called rude, but neither did they seem entirely sure what to make of her. Cole looked at the table, biscuits, the beans improved with onion and pepper she'd found, a pan of fried potatoes from the cold ones she'd discovered in the cellar, and then at Isabella, and something moved across his face that she couldn't categorize before it was gone. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "The alternative was watching someone else do it badly," she said. Deacon made a sound that might have been a laugh. They ate. Cole asked the hands about the fence line on the north pasture. Deacon gave a report in his abbreviated style. Pete ate 3 biscuits without saying anything. Maisie sat beside Isabella. She had done this without asking, had simply moved her chair slightly closer during the meal. And once, when Isabella reached past her for the salt, Maisie didn't move away. She sat very still instead, as if she were trying to memorize the proximity. After the hands had gone and Maisie had been sent to bed, with the particular resistance of a child who knows she's losing the argument, Cole poured 2 cups of coffee and left one on the table near where Isabella was washing dishes. She dried her hands and picked it up. "You don't have to keep working," he said. He was leaning against the counter with his own cup, not quite looking at her. "You're not... This isn't your responsibility." "I know that," Isabella said. "I just want to be clear. Thursday, you can..." "I know Thursday," she said, not unkindly. "I'm not under any illusion about the situation." Cole was quiet for a moment. "What will you do after Cedar Bluff?" "I haven't decided." She drank the coffee. It was strong and not very good, and she drank it anyway because it was warm and she hadn't had anything warm since morning. "Something practical. I'm good at practical." "The man who wrote those letters," Cole said. He was looking at his cup now. "Whoever he is, he knew this address. He used this ranch. I thought of that. That's not nothing. That's not a mistake. Someone who knows this land, or at least knows the name of it, is out there convincing women to travel here under false pretenses. He said it slowly, like he was working through it as he spoke. You might not be the first. The coffee cup was warm against her palms. No, she said. I might not be. Cole looked up at her then, directly, for the first time since the barn. It was the same measuring look Maisie had, but without the waiting underneath it. Just assessment, honest and uncomplicated. I'll ask around in town tomorrow, he said. See if anyone knows the name. You don't have to. I know, he said, and turned to pour the rest of his coffee into the basin. Good night, Miss Carter. She stood in the kitchen after he left, in the quiet of a house that belonged to strangers, and listened to the wind outside and the distant sound of horses settling in the barn, and thought about a man named Benjamin Hale, who did not exist. She told herself she wasn't going to unpack. There was no reason to unpack for 3 days. She unpacked anyway because she was the kind of person who could not live out of a bag without feeling like she was already leaving before she'd arrived. Her extra dress went in the small wardrobe. Her book, The Yearling, which she hadn't actually been reading but carried because her mother had given it to her, went on the windowsill. Her mother's hairbrush she placed beside the basin carefully. She lay on the narrow bed in the dark with the wind pressing against the window glass, and she thought about the route back. Kansas City from Cedar Bluff, then southeast. The rooming houses in Wichita that took women alone. The work available to a woman in her position. Laundry, domestic service, seamstress work if she could find a shop that needed the help. All of it possible. None of it what she'd been heading toward. She told herself, when she'd answered Benjamin Hale's first letter, that she was being rational, that she'd weighed the known risks against the known alternative and made an adult decision, that mail-order arrangements were common and practical, and there was no shame in them, that a man who wrote with that kind of plain directness was more trustworthy than a man who promised things he couldn't name. She had been right about all of that, and still ended up here. Practical, she thought, only takes you so far. She was up before dawn. Not because she couldn't sleep, she'd slept, finally, after the wind died down sometime after midnight, but because that was when she woke up. Had since she was a girl. The habit of early rising was so old it had stopped feeling like a habit and started feeling like a fact about herself. The kitchen was cold and dark. She built up the fire in the stove from embers, filled the kettle, and stood at the window watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue, to the particular gray-pink of early morning while she waited for the water to heat. The ranch in the early morning was different than it had been in the afternoon. The scale of it was more apparent. The long sweep of the pastures, the dark line of tree cover to the north, the mountains in the far distance that she hadn't quite registered the day before. They were always there, she realized. You just had to be still long enough to see them. She was pouring her first cup of coffee when she heard boots on the stairs. Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed. Work shirt, suspenders, boots that needed resoling, and stopped when he saw her. You're up, he said. Appears so. He looked at the fire, the kettle, the cup already in her hand. You didn't have to. The fire was going to need rebuilding either way, Isabella said. There's enough water for another cup. He poured himself one and stood at the other end of the counter, and for a while they were both quiet in the way of people who don't know each other well enough yet to fill silence comfortably, but have enough self-possession not to force it. How long has this been your ranch? Isabella asked, because she was curious and there was no reason not to be direct about it. My father built the main house in 1861, Cole said. I was born here. Took it over in 79 when he died. He turned his cup in his hands. My wife came out in 82. She was from Illinois. He said it simply, without particular weight, but she heard the past tense and understood it. How long ago did you lose her? She asked. 4 years. He drank his coffee. Maisie was 4. She told me, Isabella said. She remembers her mother's hands. She said they were smaller than yours and always warm. Cole was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the window, at the pale morning light. She doesn't talk about her mother much, he said finally. She talked to me, Isabella said. He didn't say anything to that. He finished his coffee, rinsed his cup, and picked up his hat from the hook by the back door. I'll ride into town this morning, he said. Ask about the name. Cole. It was the first time she'd used his name. He paused with his hand on the door. Thank you. For the room. For Thursday. He looked back at her. Just a glance, not long. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thursday's still 4 days away. And he went out, and Isabella heard the yard come alive with the ordinary sounds of a working ranch morning. And she poured herself a second cup of coffee and stood at the window watching the mountains come clear as the light strengthened, thinking about a man who didn't exist, and a room she hadn't meant to unpack, and a child who'd moved her chair closer at supper without saying a word about it. By the second morning, she had established something like a rhythm without meaning to. Maisie appeared in the kitchen shortly after Cole left each day, drawn by coffee smell or habit or something she didn't explain, and sat at the table watching Isabella work with that same focused attention she'd had from the first moment. She had questions. She had a great many questions, delivered in no particular order. About Kansas, about the stagecoach, about whether Isabella had ever seen a real river flood, about whether it was true that women in cities wore different shoes than women in Wyoming, about the book on the windowsill and whether she could touch it. You can read it if you want, Isabella said. You can read, can't you? Pa taught me, Maisie said, slightly affronted. I can read well. I read better than Pete and Pete's 20. That's a low bar, but a fair point, Isabella said. Maisie looked up at her sharply, and then, unexpectedly, grinned. A quick, bright thing that changed her face entirely. It was there, and then it was controlled again, like she'd caught herself doing something unguarded, but Isabella had seen it and filed it away. Thoughts. Cole came back from town on Tuesday afternoon with an expression that told her something before he'd said a word. Isabella was in the yard with Maisie, who had been trying to teach her the specific and apparently deeply technical skill of identifying which of the barn cats was which. By their markings alone, there were 7. When Cole came through the gate on his horse, and she looked up and saw his face, she met him at the barn while Maisie ran ahead to tell Pete something about a cat named General who had been missing since morning. There's no record of a Benjamin Hale, Cole said, unhitching his horse. The land office in town has no property under that name. The post office has no one registered at that address other than this ranch. The sheriff knows the name now, but he didn't before. Isabella had expected this. She'd been expecting it since the moment she'd seen his face over the letters in the barn. Did he say anything useful? He said there was a woman who came through Cedar Bluff about 8 months ago, Cole said. His voice was carefully even. Looking for a man named Thomas Carr at a ranch near Laramie. Letters, same kind of arrangement. Man didn't exist. Ranch turned out to be a real property under a different owner. The wind moved through the yard. She wasn't the only one, Isabella said. Sheriff didn't know of any others for certain, but he said the pattern, the letters, the frontier address, the arrangement, it had enough similarity that he'd already written to Laramie about it. He turned and looked at her directly. Someone is doing this deliberately, targeting women who are alone, Isabella said. Women who are alone and have nothing to lose by leaving. Yes, she thought about the letters in her coat pocket, the careful, practical sentences. I am not a man of poetry, but I am a man who means what he says. Someone had written those sentences knowing exactly how they would land, knowing exactly what kind of woman they would appeal to. That was the part that made her jaw tighten, not the practical disaster of it. She'd handled practical disasters. It was the specificity of it, the deliberateness. Someone had thought carefully about her before she'd ever known he existed, and had seen not a person but a condition, alone, movable, without backup. Miss Carter, Cole said. I'm all right, she said. I didn't say you weren't. You were about to say something careful, she said. I can see it. You don't have to be careful. I've been thinking about this since I got here. Someone used your address. Either they know this place or they picked it randomly off some list and got lucky. Either way, it's not nothing. Cole was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It's not nothing. When I get to Cedar Bluff Thursday, I'm going to ask questions, she said. I'm going to talk to the sheriff there. If there are other women, you'd be a stranger in a town you've never been to with no standing and no resources, Cole said. Not arguing, just naming the facts the same way she would have. I know that, she said. I'm good at working with limited resources. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll write a letter to the sheriff here on your behalf, he said finally, So you've got a name to use when you get there. It was a practical offer. She received it practically. Thank you, she said. Maisie came running back from the barn with the news that General had been found inside a grain barrel and was fine and had 4 new friends in there with him. And the conversation ended because life on a working ranch didn't pause for anything, which was, Isabella was beginning to understand, one of the more honest things about it. Wednesday, she helped Deacon mend a section of fence line on the east pasture. She had offered because the work needed doing and there weren't enough hands for it, and because standing still made her think too much. Deacon had looked at her sideways, not unkindly, just assessing, and handed her the wire stretcher without comment. They worked mostly in silence, which suited both of them. Deacon spoke when he had something useful to say, and didn't when he didn't, which Isabella respected as a philosophy. At mid-morning, he handed her a canteen and said, out of nowhere, "Cole's a decent man." Isabella drank, handed the canteen back. "I can see that. He doesn't say a lot, but he does what he says." Deacon took the canteen and didn't look at her. "Been hard since Evelyn died. House went quiet. Maisie went quiet. He did what he had to, but He paused, searching. The ease went out of it. Like someone took the lamp out of the room. It was still a room, but darker. Isabella kept her hands on the wire. "She cooked in the mornings," Deacon said. "Evelyn made coffee loud enough to wake the whole house. She was from Illinois, city woman. Came out here and learned how to be useful like she'd been doing it all her life." He paused again. "Didn't say she was like you. Just saying the house remembers having someone in it that way." "I'm leaving Thursday," Isabella said. "I know," Deacon said, and went back to the fence post. "Do it." That night, Isabella sat on the edge of her bed with the letters spread on the quilt in front of her, 4 of them. She'd read them so many times she could have recited them from memory. She read them again anyway, this time differently. Not as promises, not as evidence of a future. As a document, as something left by someone who had known what he was doing. The handwriting was consistent, educated. Not a man who'd learned his letters late or in a hurry. Someone who'd had formal schooling and written enough to develop a particular style. Slight lean to the right, capital letters with a specific flourish on the H. She'd noticed the H before. She noticed it again now. The details he'd given about Stone Creek Ranch were real details. The acreage, the pasture descriptions, the mention of a north fence line that needed work. Those were not invented specifics. Those were the details of someone who knew this place, or had known it once, or had gotten his information from someone who did. She folded the letters carefully, put them back in her coat pocket. Thursday, she thought, Cedar Bluff, and then whatever came after that. She blew out the lamp. Through the window, she could see the stars. More of them than she'd ever seen in Kansas, more than she'd thought the sky could hold. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there. She'd learned that about this place already. Some things you couldn't see from where you stood. That didn't mean they weren't there. She lay back on the narrow bed that wasn't hers, in the room she'd unpacked without meaning to, on the edge of a ranch that had been built by someone she'd never met, and inherited by a man who didn't know her name 4 days ago. And she lay there listening to Wyoming being quiet all around her until she fell asleep. Thursday morning, Maisie came to the kitchen earlier than usual. Isabella was already there, fire built, coffee on, the last of the cold biscuits warming in the oven because there was no reason not to use them before she left. She heard the stairs, the particular sound of a child trying to walk quietly and not quite managing it, and then Maisie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair unbraided and loose around her face. She stood there for a moment looking at Isabella in the way she had, that measuring, careful look that was so much her father's and so entirely her own at the same time. "You're leaving today," she said. "The coach comes at noon," Isabella said. Maisie came and sat at the table. She didn't say anything else for a while. Isabella plated the biscuits and put one in front of her and poured a small cup of coffee with more milk than coffee, the way she'd noticed Maisie liked it, and sat down across from her with her own cup. "Pa said you came for a man who doesn't exist," Maisie said. "That's right. That seems bad." "It's not ideal," Isabella said. Maisie broke her biscuit in half. She looked at it. "If the man had existed," she said carefully, "you'd be at a different ranch." "Yes." "Not here." "No." Maisie was quiet for a moment. I'm glad he didn't exist, she said very quietly, as if she knew it was a complicated thing to say, and was saying it anyway because it was true. She looked up at Isabella. Is that bad? To be glad? Isabella looked at this child, this small, serious, careful person who had moved her chair closer at supper and showed her where the flour was kept and remembered her mother's hands, and felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. No, she said. That's not bad. Maisie nodded once, as if that settled it, and ate her biscuit. Cole came in at 7:30. He looked at the table, at Maisie, at the cup of coffee already waiting for him at his usual place. He sat down and drank it, and said nothing about the fact that Isabella had made it, and nothing about the fact that this was the last morning that was going to be the case. They ate breakfast. Deacon knocked and took his plate to the porch, as was apparently his habit. Pete ate standing up by the stove and left before anyone else, as was apparently his habit. Maisie told a long story about General the Cat and his new friends in the grain barrel that had no clear ending, and that Cole listened to with the patient attention of someone who has learned that some stories don't end so much as stop. At 11, Isabella brought her bag out of the room. The wardrobe was empty again. Her book was in the bag. The hairbrush was in the bag. The room looked the way it had when she arrived. Plain, small, the window looking out on the side yard. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked to the kitchen and put on her coat. Maisie was in the yard. She had not said goodbye, Isabella noticed. She was throwing feed to the chickens with the focused purpose of someone who has decided not to acknowledge something. Cole was at the barn. He straightened when he saw her come out with her bag and walked over. The road into town, he started. I'll be fine, Isabella said. It's a clear day. He handed her an envelope. The letter for the sheriff in Cedar Bluff. And he hesitated in the way of a man who doesn't like hesitating. $10. Don't argue. It's not charity. Consider it payment for 4 days of cooking and fence work. Isabella looked at the envelope. She looked at him. It was 3 days of cooking and a day of fence work, he said. Deacon said you pulled wire cleaner than Pete. That's worth something. She took the envelope. Thank you, Cole. He nodded. He looked like he might say something else, and then didn't. Maisie was still throwing feed when Isabella came through the yard with her bag. She walked past and then stopped. Maisie, she said. The girl turned. Her expression was very controlled, in the way of children who have learned to control their expressions because being unguarded hurts. Isabella crouched down so they were level. I'm glad I came to the wrong ranch, she said, even if it was for the wrong reasons. This was a good few days. Maisie's expression held. Will you come back? Isabella thought about the road to Cedar Bluff, the telegraph lines, the return to Kansas, to something that was not quite home because home was gone. She thought about letters that had turned out to be fiction and a practical decision that had ended practically wrong. I don't know, she said. It was the honest answer. Maisie nodded. She had the look of someone who had expected that answer and made her peace with it in advance, which was worse than if she'd argued. Isabella stood, picked up her bag, walked through the gate. She didn't look back until she reached the first bend in the road, and when she did, the gate was visible in the distance, and Maisie was still standing in the yard watching her go, with the feed bucket hanging from one hand. Isabella turned and kept walking. The mountains were clear ahead. The road was straight. The day was cold and bright and going somewhere, and so was she. Toward a town she'd never been to, with a letter in her pocket for a sheriff she'd never met. In a state that was still not quite real to her, looking for a man who didn't exist. She had done harder things with less. She walked. The road to Cedar Bluff was 9 miles of nothing in particular. Isabella had expected that. She'd walked the first 3 miles before a farm wagon heading the same direction slowed beside her and the driver, an older man with a white beard and the patient expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, offered her the bench without asking questions. She climbed up and they rode in comfortable silence for the remaining 6 miles, which was the best kind of company for the kind of morning she was having. Cedar Bluff was larger than she'd imagined from Cole's description. 2 main streets crossing each other at a right angle, a dozen storefronts on each side, a church at the north end and a livery at the south, a hotel in the middle that had a fresh coat of paint on the sign, even if the building underneath it needed work. There was a telegraph office next to the post office, which was what she needed first. She thanked the wagon driver. He tipped his hat and drove on. The telegraph office was run by a thin young man who wrote down her message without reading it, which she appreciated, and told her the rate, which used more of Cole's $10 than she'd hoped, but left her enough for 2 nights at the hotel if she was careful. She sent the wire to the one person she could think of who might be useful, a woman named Ruth Alcott in Wichita, who had been her mother's friend and who ran a boarding house, and who might, if asked directly and practically, know of work that could be done remotely or by letter while Isabella figured out her next step. Then she walked to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades watching people try to talk faster than they could think. He read Cole's letter without hurry, set it down on his desk, and looked at her across it. "Cole Mercer wrote this," he said. "He did. I know Cole. Known him since his father's time." He picked up the letter again, not reading it, just holding it. "Says here you came out on a mail order arrangement. Man named Benjamin Hale." "That's right." "And Hale doesn't exist." The sheriff in Stone Creek confirmed that. No land record, no post registration, no name. Pruitt set the letter down. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight in a way that sounded habitual. "I'm going to tell you something, Miss Carter, and I want you to hear all of it before you respond." He said this without condescension, just the preamble of a man who'd learned that people interrupted when they got to the part that bothered them. "This is the 3rd such case in this county in 2 years. 2 others I know of in Laramie County. One in Carbon County that might be connected, might not. Each one a woman traveling alone. Each one with correspondence describing a legitimate property. Each one arriving to find the address real and the name false." Isabella had steadied herself on the walk over. She'd thought she was prepared for confirmation. She found that confirmation and preparation were not the same thing. "3rd in this county," she said. "3rd that I know of," Pruitt said, "which means there may be more I don't." "What happened to the other 2? He was quiet for a beat. "One went back east. I don't know where she ended up. The other—" He paused. "The other had no money to go back. She stayed in Cedar Bluff for a time, worked at the hotel. Last I heard, she was in Laramie." "Do you have a name for either of them?" Pruitt looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because if there are more women, they may have more information than I do. They may have kept their letters. They may remember details." She kept her voice even. "I'm not being impulsive, Sheriff. I'm being practical. Someone is doing this deliberately, and I would like to understand what I was part of." Pruitt studied her for a long moment, the way he'd studied the letter, without hurry, without the false neutrality of someone trying to seem impartial while already having decided. He was actually looking at her. "The one who stayed," he said finally. "Her name was Clara Marsh. She was in Laramie as of 8 months ago. I don't have a current address." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "What I do have is a name that came up twice across those cases. Not the name the women were given, not Hale or Carr or whatever alias was used. A real name, or what might be a real name, that appeared in background inquiries I did after the 2nd case." He picked up a pencil and wrote on a piece of paper, pushed it across the desk toward her. "Victor Aldis. No confirmed connection, no warrants. But the name appeared in paperwork related to a land speculation scheme out of Cheyenne about 3 years back that went sideways, and the man connected to that scheme had a habit of targeting women with no local ties." Isabella looked at the name on the paper. "Do you know where he is now?" "No," Pruitt said. "And I want to be clear. I'm not giving you this information so you can go find him. I'm giving it to you because you strike me as the kind of woman who's going to look anyway, and it's better you have something accurate to work with than go in blind." He held her gaze. "Are we understanding each other?" "We are," Isabella said. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, next to the letters. Outside, the main street of Cedar Bluff was going about its midday business. A woman with a basket, 2 men in front of the hardware store talking with the serious intensity of men discussing weather or prices. A dog asleep in a patch of sun by the livery. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of scene that had been happening in this town every day for years while somewhere, someone was writing letters to women in Kansas. She stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office and let the cold air settle around her and thought about what came next. The hotel was $2 a night. She had enough for 2 nights, which gave her until Saturday. Ruth Alcott's reply, if Ruth replied at all, might take 3 or 4 days to reach her by telegraph. She could look for work in Cedar Bluff, a few days of domestic work, hotel cleaning, anything, to extend her time. She could write to the sheriff in Laramie and ask about Clara Marsh. She could do both. She went to the hotel and paid for 1 night, not 2, to keep her options open. The room was smaller than the one at Stone Creek Ranch and not as clean, but it had a lock on the door and a lamp on the table, and she'd slept in worse. She did not unpack. The hotel had a small dining room on the ground floor where a tired-looking woman in her 40s served meals at specific hours with the efficiency of someone working alone. Isabella ate supper, a plate of beef stew that was competent, if not inspired, and listened to the room, which held a traveling salesman, a family with 2 young children, and a pair of men she couldn't place who spoke to each other in low voices and ate quickly. She was finishing her coffee when the woman who'd served dinner came by with a cloth to wipe the adjacent table and paused beside her. "You just in, or staying a few days?" she asked. Not unfriendly, just the practical economy of someone who needed to plan meals. "A few days, I think," Isabella said. "Maybe less. I'm trying to arrange my next step." The woman, her name was Agnes, she said it without being asked, which Isabella appreciated, looked at her with the particular attention of a woman who has identified another woman in an uncertain situation. "You're not from here?" "Kansas," Isabella said. "I came out for a—" She paused, because how to explain it was still something she hadn't entirely worked out. "A situation that didn't turn out the way I expected." Agnes folded the cloth. "Job situation or man situation?" "Man situation. No man!" Agnes made a sound that was not quite sympathetic and not quite unsurprised. "There's work here if you need it," she said. "Not much and not well paying, but the hotel needs help in the mornings. Kitchen work mostly, and turning the rooms. Owner's name is Carver. He's fair." She paused. "I say he's fair. He pays on time and he doesn't bother the women who work here. That's what fair looks like out here mostly." "I appreciate that," Isabella said, and meant it. She went to find Mr. Carver after supper. He was a compact man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the distracted manner of someone perpetually managing more than he had staff for. He hired her for mornings on the spot, offered $2 a day, and asked if she could start the following morning. She told him she could. He told her to be there at 6. She was. The work was not complicated. Fires in the rooms, water hauled up, beds stripped and made, the kitchen floor swept before the breakfast rush. It was physical and repetitive and left her mind free to work while her hands were occupied, which was exactly what she needed. She wrote a letter to the Laramie County Sheriff on Wednesday. She spent most of Thursday morning composing it carefully. Not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. The names used, the dates, the address, the sheriff's name in Stone Creek as a reference. She mailed it with the last of her reserve and hoped it arrived before her situation became truly difficult. Ruth Alcott's telegraph reply came Friday afternoon, and it was not what she'd hoped for. Boarding house, full stop, difficult season. Full stop. No positions, currently. Full stop. Sorry, my dear. Full stop. Sorry, my dear. Isabella read it twice, standing at the telegraph office counter, then folded it and thanked the young man and walked out into the afternoon cold. She sat down on the bench outside the post office, which was the only public bench on the main street, and she allowed herself to acknowledge, clearly and without drama, that she was in trouble. Not crisis. She had work, she had a roof, she had enough to eat for now. But the path back to anything resembling stable ground was narrower than it had been, and she could see the edges of it. A letter arrived the following day, not from Laramie, but from Stone Creek. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Not Cole's. She'd never seen his handwriting. Smaller, less steady. She opened it standing in the hotel lobby and read it there. "Dear Miss Carter, my pa is making me write this properly, so I am. He says to say, we hope you are well in Cedar Bluff. I am writing to say that General the cat had 4 kittens under the kitchen stove, and one of them is orange. Pete says it can't be General's because General is a boy, but I think Pete is wrong. Deacon fixed the east fence. Also, Pa said I could ask if you needed anything, which means he wants to know, but he didn't want to write it himself, so I am writing it for him. Maisie Mercer, P.S. I read your book. It was good. I left it on the windowsill in case you came back for it. Isabella read the letter twice. Then she folded it and stood for a moment in the hotel lobby with the cold air coming in from the open door and the sound of Cedar Bluff going about its business outside, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not homesickness exactly, because Stone Creek Ranch had never been her home, but something adjacent to it, something that pressed against the inside of her chest in a way that was uncomfortable and real. She went to her room and wrote back, "Dear Maisie, I am glad General's kittens are well. Pete is statistically likely to be wrong about most things involving cats. Thank the orange one for me. I am working at the hotel here for the time being while I figure out what comes next. The sheriff has been helpful. I have learned some things about the man whose letters brought me west, none of them good, and I am trying to find out more. Please tell your father that the letter he wrote for me to the sheriff was useful and that I am grateful for it. Take care of the east fence. I left my book on the windowsill on purpose. Isabella Carter." She sealed it. She mailed it. She did not say anything about the path back narrowing, or Ruth Alcott's telegram, or the fact that the path forward was still unclear. There was no reason to say those things to a child. The reply from Laramie came 8 days after she'd sent her letter, and it was from the Laramie County Sheriff's deputy rather than the sheriff himself. But it contained two things of value: a confirmation that a Victor Aldis had in fact been involved in a land correspondence scheme that had been investigated but not prosecuted 2 years prior, and more importantly, an address. Not Aldis's address. Clara Marsh's. She had written to ask to be found. Clara Marsh was living in Laramie, working as a seamstress. She had sent her reply care of the deputy because she'd had a letter from him the previous month asking if she'd be willing to speak with other women affected by similar situations. Her letter was brief and careful, but it contained one line that Isabella read 3 times. "I kept all the letters he sent me. I don't know if they're useful, but I kept them." Isabella was back at the sheriff's office that afternoon. Pruitt listened to the update without interrupting. He had that quality, the ability to receive information without crowding it with his own reactions, that she'd noticed the first time and appreciated more now. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want to go to Laramie," he said. "I want to compare the letters," Isabella said. "If they're from the same person, the same handwriting, the same specific details, that's evidence that means something. That's pattern rather than coincidence. That's something a court can work with." "You're not a lawyer," Pruitt said. "No," Isabella said. "But I know how evidence works. My father kept accounts. He showed me how a clear record changes what's possible." She paused. "Someone targeted me, and apparently other women. I'd like to know why, and I'd like there to be some consequence for it, even if I'm the one who has to build the case." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "Laramie is 2 days by coach," he said. "That's money you may not have." "I have some," she said. It was almost true. "The coach leaves Monday," he said. He said it flatly, like he was telling her the weather. Then he opened his desk drawer and set a folded bill on the desk between them. "That's from the county discretionary account, for witness assistance. Don't thank me. It's not personal, it's procedural. Any witness traveling in connection with an active inquiry is entitled to transportation assistance." He held her gaze steadily. "I opened an active inquiry this morning." Isabella looked at the bill. She looked at him. "How long has that account existed?" "About 20 minutes, Pruitt said. She picked up the bill. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Monday," he said. "And when you get to Laramie, you go to the county courthouse and you ask for a clerk named Ellsworth. Tell him Pruitt sent you. He'll know how to get the letters documented properly if they're what you think they are." Trot. She spent the weekend finishing her work at the hotel and saying nothing to Mr. Carver about Monday until Sunday evening, when she gave him notice that was as gracious as 4 days' notice could be. He took it without complaint. She'd been reliable, he said, which in his tone meant more than it would have in a different context, and paid her for the week with an extra $50 that he put down to rounding. On Sunday night, she sat at the small table in her hotel room with a sheet of paper and a pen she'd borrowed from the front desk, and she wrote to Cole. She told him about the sheriff's inquiry, about Victor Aldis, about Clara Marsh and Laramie. She told him she was going Monday on county assistance and that she expected to be in Laramie by Wednesday. and that if the letters were what she believed them to be, there was a real possibility of a documented case against someone who had done this to multiple women with apparent organization and intent. She wrote all of that in the careful, practical way she wrote most things, and then she stopped. She looked at the paper. She added one more line. Maisie's letter arrived. Tell her Pete is still wrong about the cat. She sealed it. She set it aside to mail in the morning. Then she sat in the lamp-lit room with the window dark behind her and thought about the orange kitten under the kitchen stove, and a book left on a windowsill on purpose, and a child who moved her chair closer without saying anything about it. Us. The coach to Laramie left at 7 in the morning from in front of the feed store on the main street. Isabella was there at 10 to 7 with her bag and her coat and the folded paper in her pocket with Victor Aldis's name on it and the 2 letters that Clara Marsh had sent through the deputy, which she'd already read 4 times. There were 3 other passengers, a man in a business suit who read without looking up the entire journey, a woman with a small child who slept against her shoulder for the first 2 hours, and an older rancher who talked to Isabella for the first hour about the state of beef prices and the likelihood of a hard winter before he also fell asleep. The country between Cedar Bluff and Laramie was vast and cold and beautiful in the specific way of things that don't care whether you find them beautiful or not. Long grassland going brown gold in the autumn air, the mountains always present to the west, the sky enormous and indifferent. Isabella watched it through the window and let her mind go over what she knew. 4 letters from a man named Benjamin Hale, specific and practical and appealing precisely because they were those things. A real address used deliberately, a pattern of at least 3 women in this county alone, more in others. A name, Victor Aldis, connected to a previous land scheme. Letters that Clara Marsh had kept. What she was building, she knew, was not a case in the legal sense yet. It was a foundation for a case. The difference mattered. What she needed was for the documents to align, for the handwriting in her letters and Clara Marsh's letters to be demonstrably similar, for the specific details used to show knowledge of particular properties, for there to be a trail of something that a prosecutor could follow. She was not naive about how difficult that would be. She knew that schemes like this often went unprosecuted, not because they were impossible to prove, but because the women they targeted had no standing, no resources, and no one in the legal system who considered the crime serious enough to pursue. She knew all of that. She intended to make it hard for anyone to use those reasons as excuses. The coach arrived in Laramie at 5:30 on Tuesday. Isabella found a rooming house 2 blocks from the main street. Cheaper than the hotel, a shared parlor on the ground floor, a landlady named Mrs. Voss who asked no questions beyond whether she smoked inside, which Isabella did not. And she was at the address she had for Clara Marsh at 9 o'clock Wednesday morning. Clara Marsh lived above a tailor's shop. She was younger than Isabella had imagined from her letter, 24, perhaps 25, with light brown hair and the slightly watchful expression of someone who had learned to be careful about what she said and to whom. She opened the door when Isabella knocked, read the letter of introduction from Deputy Rawlings that Isabella handed through the gap, and then opened the door fully and stepped back. "Come in," she said. "I'll put water on." The apartment was small and tidy, the tidiness of someone who controlled her environment because other things could not be controlled. A sewing basket on the table, fabric folded neatly on the chair, a shelf of books, a window overlooking the alley below, which let in gray light. Clara made tea in a way that suggested she was organizing her thoughts. Isabella sat at the table and waited. "I kept telling myself I should throw them away," Clara said, setting a cup in front of Isabella and sitting across from her. "The letters. Every time I looked at them, I thought, just burn them. There's nothing useful in them. They're just a record of how foolish you were." She held her own cup but didn't drink from it. "But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someone would want to see them someday." "You weren't foolish," Isabella said. "You made a reasonable decision based on information someone gave you deliberately to mislead you. That's not foolishness. That's being deceived." Clara looked at her. "You sound very certain of that." "I've had 3 weeks to think about it," Isabella said. "I was very certain I was foolish for the first week. Then I started being angry instead, and angry is more useful." Something in Clara's expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but something that could become one. "The letters are in the box on the shelf." They spread them on the table. Isabella had 4. Clara had 5. They laid them out side by side, Clara's on the left, Isabella's on the right, and they looked at the handwriting. It was the same hand. There was no question about it. The same slight rightward lean, the same H with its particular flourish. The letters themselves were different in their specifics, different names used, different property details, different supposed circumstances. But they had been written by the same person. The phrasing in certain places was identical. Not similar. Identical. "I am not a man of poetry," Clara read from her first letter. "But I am a man who means what he says." Isabella's throat tightened. "I have that exact line," she said. They looked at each other across the table. "He sent that to both of us," Clara said. "And probably to others," Isabella said. "He had a form, not a form letter in the crude sense. He changed the details, the name, the property, enough to seem specific. But the core of it was a template. That's what the identical phrases mean. He was efficient, he'd found what worked, and he repeated it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What did he want?" she said. "I've thought about this. I don't understand what he wanted. We arrived at a stranger's property with no money and no way back. He wasn't there to—" She stopped. "Was it just to strand us?" It was a question Isabella had turned over many times. "I think," she said carefully, "it may be about the properties. If women in distress show up at isolated ranches with no standing, no local connections, no way to leave quickly, those ranches become complicated. There are legal mechanisms. If a woman can claim she was brought to a property under a false marriage agreement, it creates questions of liability, it can freeze a title, complicate a sale." She paused. "I'm not certain. It's a theory." Clara stared at her. "He was using us to interfere with property sales? Or to create leverage over the property owners? To make their titles uncertain while he moved in on something else?" Isabella shook her head. "I don't have proof, but Victor Aldis was connected to a land speculation scheme. This feels like a version of the same approach with less obvious fingerprints." Clara looked down at the letters spread between them. "What do we do?" "We take these to the courthouse," Isabella said. "I have a name. A clerk named Ellsworth, sent by the sheriff in Cedar Bluff. We get these documented. We write down everything we remember about the process, how the first contact was made, the specific wording used, the timing. We make a record that can be compared to whatever records exist from the previous investigation." She looked up at Clara. "And if there are other women, if Ellsworth or the county has any record of other reports, we find them." Clara looked at the letters again. Then she nodded once, with the particular decisiveness of someone who has made a choice and closed the door on second-guessing it. "All right," she said. "When?" "This afternoon," Isabella said, "before I talk myself into needing more preparation." Clara almost smiled. "You do that too?" "All the time," Isabella said. "It's easier to act before the doubt catches up." They gathered the letters carefully, Clara's in one stack and Isabella's in another, and placed them in Clara's letterbox. They put on their coats. They went down the stairs and out into the Laramie afternoon. Cold, busy, the main street full of wagons and horses and people going about the ordinary work of a town. And they walked toward the courthouse together, two women with a box of letters and a theory, and the specific, quiet fury of people who have decided that what was done to them deserves to have a name. The courthouse was a stone building at the north end of the main street, solid and gray and permanent looking in the way of official buildings that have been put up to last. Isabella held the door. Clara went through first. Ellsworth was a small man with ink-stained fingers and a filing system that occupied most of his office. He read Pruitt's note with the careful attention of someone who took written instructions seriously, looked at both women over his glasses, and asked them to sit down. "You have letters," he said. "9 of them," Isabella said. 5 from Miss Marsh's correspondence and 4 from mine. Both addressed to us under false names using real property addresses, both containing identical language and key passages. Ellsworth looked at the box Clara set on his desk. He did not open it. "And the name you have? Aldis?" "Connected to a prior investigation in Cheyenne. Unresolved." Ellsworth wrote something on a notepad. He asked them 3 or 4 more careful questions. Dates, routes, how first contact had been made, whether any money had changed hands, and they both answered as precisely as they could. Then he opened the box and looked at the letters, handling them gently and with a methodical attention that suggested he'd done this sort of work before. "This will take some time," he said. "I'll need to request the Cheyenne records. Cross-reference the land parcels used in the correspondence." He looked at Isabella. "Are you staying in Laramie?" "For now," she said. "I'll be in touch within the week," Ellsworth said. He looked at both of them with the unhurried steadiness of a man who understood that the work he did was quiet and slow and mattered. "You did the right thing keeping those letters," he said to Clara. Clara looked at the box on his desk. "I nearly didn't," she said. "Most people don't," Ellsworth said. "That's why most cases like this never get very far." They came out of the courthouse into the cooling afternoon. The sun was lower now, cutting across the rooftops at a long angle that turned the street gold and cold at the same time. Isabella stood on the courthouse steps beside Clara and felt the particular exhaustion of having done the right thing. Not the relief exactly, but the flatness after effort. "What do you do now?" Clara asked. "Wait," Isabella said. "Work. Think." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You mentioned the rancher who let you stay in Stone Creek." "Cole Mercer," Isabella said. "Are you going back there?" Isabella looked at the street, the horses at the hitching post, the ordinary Laramie afternoon. She thought about the 9 miles of road between Stone Creek and Cedar Bluff, walked in cold air with a bag that was lighter than she'd wished, a child throwing feed to chickens with her back deliberately turned, a letter about an orange kitten under a stove. "I don't know," she said, which was the same answer she'd given Maisie. Clara nodded. She seemed to understand that some questions had the same true answer no matter who asked them. They walked back toward the main street, and the courthouse stood behind them with their letters inside it, documented now, on record, existing in the official world in a way that couldn't be undone. That was something. It was not everything, and it was not fast, and it would not undo the weeks of travel and the money spent and the particular specific damage of having trusted a careful lie. But it was something real, placed in the permanent record by 2 women who had decided that being deceived once was not the same as staying silent about it. Isabella's feet were cold. She needed to find supper. She needed to write to Pruitt and tell him what Ellsworth had said. She needed to find out if Mrs. Voss had a room available for another week. She did all of those things, one after another, which was how she had always done everything. Not because it was easy, but because it was next. Ellsworth was as good as his word. His letter arrived at Mrs. Voss's rooming house 8 days after Isabella and Clara had sat across the desk from him, and it was longer than she'd expected. 4 pages in small, careful handwriting, the kind of letter a man writes when he has more to say than he initially thought, and has decided to say all of it anyway. He had cross-referenced the land parcels. 3 of the 5 property addresses used in the correspondence between Isabella and Clara's combined letters were parcels that had been listed in a disputed title filing in Albany County 18 months ago. The filing had been made by a land investment company called Meridian Holdings, whose principal agent was listed as 1 V.H. Aldis. The title disputes had been dropped quietly within 6 months, the original landowners having apparently agreed to terms that Ellsworth described, with careful bureaucratic understatement, as unusually favorable to the investment party. What that meant, in plain language, was that the landowners had been pressured enough to sell below value or settle claims they hadn't originally agreed with, and Aldis had walked away with something he hadn't come in with. The women showing up, unannounced, with false marriage agreements, at properties already under quiet title pressure, were part of the mechanism. A woman claiming to have been brought to a property under a fraudulent marriage arrangement created exactly the kind of legal noise that made a landowner's title look unstable. It didn't have to hold up in court. It just had to exist on paper long enough to make the owner willing to deal. Isabella read the letter twice at the breakfast table while Mrs. Voss moved around the kitchen behind her. Then she folded it and drank her coffee and sat for a moment with the specific cold feeling of having a theory confirmed. She'd been a tool. That was the plain word for it. A moving piece in someone else's scheme, chosen because she was alone and available and had no local ties to complicate the picture. She'd been identified, selected, and deployed. And the man who'd done it had never once needed to meet her or know her name or think of her as a person at all. She picked up her coat. She went to find Clara. Clara read the letter at her table with the same stillness she brought to most things. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the window for a moment. "He never intended for any of us to actually marry anyone," she said. "No," Isabella said. We were paperwork, or the threat of paperwork. That's... Clara stopped. She pressed her lips together. I came from Ohio, she said. I had a position as a shopkeeper's assistant that paid barely enough to live on. I had a room above a hardware store with a window that didn't close all the way. When the letter came, when he wrote about the land, the life, the... She stopped again. It wasn't naive. It felt like a reasonable thing, a real thing. It was designed to feel that way, Isabella said. He knew what he was writing and who he was writing it to. He picked women who had just enough to lose that leaving made sense, and not enough to lose that they'd have resources to fight back. Clara looked at the letter. Ellsworth says there may be up to 7 women total across the affected properties. At minimum, Isabella said, 7 that he's been able to connect to Meridian Holdings. There could be more at properties he hasn't linked yet. And Aldous? Isabella picked up the letter. She found the relevant passage and read it aloud. The current location of V.H. Aldous is not confirmed. However, county records indicate an active business registration for Meridian Holdings with a listed correspondence address in Cheyenne. A colleague in the Laramie County Prosecutor's Office has been made aware of this inquiry and has expressed interest in reviewing the documented evidence. The prosecutor's office, Clara said. Interest, Isabella said, not commitment. There's a distance between those two things. But it's something. It's something, Isabella agreed. And something is what we didn't have 3 weeks ago. Clara was quiet for a moment. She put her hand flat on the table, not quite on the letter, just near it. What do you need from me now? A written statement, Isabella said. Dated, signed, as specific as you can make it. How you found the advertisement, or however first contact was made, the dates of correspondence, the exact route you took, what happened when you arrived. Ellsworth wants it for the prosecutor's file. She paused. I've already written mine. Clara looked at the letter. All right, she said. It doesn't have to be today. It should be, Clara said, and pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. Isabella sent her own statement to Ellsworth by post that afternoon, and a separate letter to Sheriff Pruitt in Cedar Bluff summarizing the developments. Then she sat in the small parlor of Mrs. Voss's rooming house and wrote to Cole. It was harder to write than she expected, which she acknowledged only to herself and only briefly. She'd written to him before, the practical update from Cedar Bluff, the short notes about progress, and those had been straightforward. This one was different because she didn't entirely know what she was communicating or why she was communicating it with more care than the situation strictly required. She wrote about the letters, about Ellsworth's findings, about Meridian Holdings and what the land parcels meant, and why the false marriage arrangements had been useful to someone who didn't care about marriage at all. She wrote it clearly because Cole had been part of this from the beginning. His address had been used, his property had been a piece of the scheme, and he deserved to know what had been done with his land's name. Then she added, below the practical summary, Maisie wrote again. She says the orange kitten has been named Wellington after some discussion, and that Pete remains in denial about the biological circumstances. I find I think about Stone Creek more than I expected to, given that I was only there 4 days. I'm not sure what that means. I don't have a plan yet for what comes after Laramie. I wanted you to know the situation here is moving, even if slowly. Isabella. She looked at what she'd written. She considered removing the last paragraph. She sent the letter with it included. The response from Cole arrived faster than she'd expected, 5 days, which meant he'd written back almost the day he'd received hers. His handwriting was as direct as the man himself, angular, economical, no unnecessary loops. Miss Carter, the property situation you describe is something the county sheriff should know about, and I've spoken to him since your last letter. He was not surprised. Victor Aldous is apparently not unknown in this part of Wyoming, though nobody had connected the marriage correspondence to his operation before. He says the land parcel connected to Stone Creek in Ellsworth's inquiry was the eastern boundary lot. 40 acres I've been meaning to fence properly for 3 years. No title dispute was ever filed against me, but he thinks Aldous may have been working up to it. The fact that you arrived when you did, and then left without incident, may have disrupted whatever was planned for this property specifically. I hadn't thought about it that way until he said it. Wellington is a reasonable name for a cat. Maisie chose it because she said he looked serious. She asks about you at supper. Cole Mercer. P.S. The room is still here if you need it. Isabella read the last line 3 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket next to the others. The room is still here if you need it. She stood at the window of Mrs. Voss's parlor looking out at the Laramie street and thought about that sentence with the same attention she'd given Ellsworth's 4 pages, which told her something about herself that she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. No. The fire started on a Tuesday. Isabella did not know this immediately because she was in Laramie and the fire was at Stone Creek Ranch, 30 miles north and west across country, that didn't carry news quickly. What she knew on that Tuesday was that she was waiting. The prosecutor's office had requested 2 more weeks to review the documentation. Ellsworth was corresponding with a colleague in Cheyenne about Meridian Holdings' current registration status. Clara had given her statement and was going back to her work, her life. The daily business of being someone who had done what she could and was now waiting for the system to do something with it. Isabella was not good at waiting without something to do. She had found more work. A woman on the main street who ran a dress alteration shop had needed help for 2 weeks with a backlog of orders. And Isabella had spent her days there in the warm smell of fabric and steam, doing careful seam work and listening to the shopkeeper talk about Laramie in the specific detail of someone who had lived there long enough to know all its stories. The work steadied her hands and left her mind free, which was useful, except that her mind tended to go to Stone Creek when she let it wander. The letter from Maisie arrived on Thursday, 2 days after the fire she didn't yet know about, and it was different from the others. The handwriting was uneven in a way Maisie's writing never was, rushed, pressing hard on the paper. Isabella felt it before she'd read 10 words. Dear Miss Carter, I am writing because Pa says I should not. But I'm writing anyway because I think you should know. There was a fire on Tuesday in the north pasture near the ridge, and it came fast because it has been dry and the wind was bad. I went to the ridge because Charger, that is the bay colt, was in the paddock near the tree line, and I could see the smoke coming, and I thought I could get him out before it reached the fence, but the fire moved faster than I thought, and I got turned around in the smoke and I couldn't find the fence gate, and Pa came, and Miss Carter, it was very bad. Pa says I am fine, and Charger is fine, and the house did not burn, but the north barn is gone, and part of the east fence, and Pa's hands, and 2 men from the Callaway Ranch next door all fought it for 6 hours, and I am not hurt, but I was scared, and I don't think Pa has slept since Tuesday. He won't say he's scared, but he is. I can tell. I thought you would want to know. Maisie. P.S. Wellington is also fine. He was in the kitchen the whole time. Isabella set the letter down on the alteration shop counter. The shopkeeper was in the back room and didn't see her face, which was fortunate. She read the letter again. She pressed her fingertips flat against the paper. She thought about a child in smoke, turned around, unable to find the gate. She thought about Cole receiving that letter from her. Maisie asks about you at supper, 3 days before his daughter had walked toward a fire. She took off her work apron. She told the shopkeeper she needed the afternoon. She walked to the telegraph office and sent 2 wires, one to Ellsworth saying she was leaving Laramie temporarily and asking that any significant developments be sent to the Stone Creek address, and one to Stone Creek that said only, received Maisie's letter. Coming Thursday, if Coach connects. Don't argue. Isabella. She did not wait for a reply before she started packing. Asked him. The Coach North connected in Cedar Bluff, which added half a day to the journey. Isabella sat on the bench outside the Cedar Bluff station for 2 hours, waiting for the Stone Creek connection, and watched the sky to the north, which was clear and blue and gave no evidence of what had happened under it 3 days ago. She thought about Maisie's description of the smoke. I got turned around, and the specific terror in that phrase, which was not the terror of fire, but of disorientation, of not knowing which direction was out. She'd felt that way herself, standing on the road outside Stone Creek Ranch with the stagecoach already gone. The direction you'd been heading wasn't available anymore, and all the other directions looked the same, and you had to pick one anyway. The connection coach was late. She arrived at Stone Creek as the sun was going down. Cole was in the yard when the coach came through. He was carrying a fence post over one shoulder. She could see now that the east fence line had come down in at least 2 sections, the rails down and scattered, and he stopped when he saw her climb down. He set the post down. He stood and looked at her across the yard with an expression she'd come to recognize as his neutral face, which was the face he wore when he was feeling something he hadn't decided how to handle yet. I told you not to argue, Isabella said. I didn't argue, he said. I didn't reply. That's a kind of argument. He looked at her bag. He looked at the darkening sky. The north barn is gone, he said. East fence needs 3 new sections. The hands have been working double since Tuesday. He said it flatly, not as complaint, but as inventory. The house is fine. Maisie is fine. I know, Isabella said. She wrote to me. She told me she was going to. He paused. She told me after she'd already sent it. She was right to, Isabella said. Cole was quiet for a moment. He picked the fence post back up. Supper's at 6, he said. Room's the same as before. He walked back toward the fence line, and Isabella picked up her bag, and she went into the house. What? The kitchen was the same. The stove, the long table, the dried sage on the hook by the window. The room felt immediately and uncomplicatedly familiar in the way of places you've only been briefly, but where something happened that mattered. Maisie appeared before Isabella had set her bag down. She was simply there, in the doorway, in the same unbraided, near-the-bottom way she always was. And for a second, she just looked at Isabella with an expression that was working very hard to be controlled. Then she crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around Isabella's middle, her head against Isabella's ribs, and held on with the specific grip of a child who has decided that this is the correct response to a situation and is not going to be embarrassed about it. Isabella put her hand on the back of Maisie's head. She didn't say anything, neither did Maisie. They stood like that for a moment in the kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the particular smell of a house that had been through something and was still standing. Wellington is in the kitchen, Maisie said into Isabella's coat. Good, Isabella said. Maisie pulled back. She had not cried, and her expression made it clear she intended to maintain that record. I wasn't being reckless, she said. I calculated the distance to the paddock against the wind speed, and I thought I had time. Your calculation was off, Isabella said, not unkindly. The wind shifted, Maisie said, with the injured precision of someone whose error was a matter of external variables rather than personal judgment. It does that, Isabella said. Wind doesn't wait for you to recalculate. Maisie accepted this with a small nod. She went to retrieve Wellington from under the stove, where he had apparently taken up permanent residence, and presented him, a dense, orange, extraordinarily calm kitten, with the air of completing an important introduction. Wellington looked at Isabella with mild, unhurried eyes. He's very serious looking, Isabella said. That's why I named him Wellington, Maisie said. Over supper, Cole gave a fuller account of the fire than Maisie's letter had. In the spare way, he gave accounts of most things, factual, in order, without editorializing. The fire had started somewhere in the dry grass near the northern ridge, probably from a spark off the rails at the freight line 2 miles east, which had been running hot in the dry weather. It had moved fast because of the wind and because the grass had not seen rain in 3 weeks. By the time he'd seen the smoke and gotten the hands organized, it had already taken the north barn, which had been mostly empty, fortunately, and was moving toward the main pasture. He'd stopped it at the firebreak they'd dug, which had taken most of the afternoon, and that was when he'd realized Maisie wasn't in the house. He said that part with the same flat delivery as the rest of it, but Isabella noticed that he stopped for a moment between that sentence and the next, in a way that wasn't his usual pause for thinking. Pete found her near the ridge, he said. She was about 40 feet from the paddock gate. She'd gotten turned around in the smoke. The gate was to my left, Maisie said, with the slightly aggrieved tone of someone who had gone over this. I thought it was to my right. Smoke does that, Deacon said, from his end of the table. He said it without particular drama, just the acknowledgement of a man who had seen smoke before and knew what it did to a person's sense of direction. Pete was quieter than usual. He'd been the one to find Maisie, and Isabella thought he probably had his own version of those minutes that he was not going to tell at the table, and perhaps not anywhere. After the hands had gone and Maisie had been sent to bed, without resistance for once, which said more about her exhaustion than anything else, Isabella and Cole sat in the kitchen with coffee, the same way they had the first night she'd stayed. She's all right, Cole said. I know, Isabella said. You didn't have to come back. I know that too, she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. The situation in Laramie, he said, with Ellsworth in the prosecutor's office. Still pending, Isabella said. It may be months before anything moves. Prosecutors move slowly, especially with schemes that operated across county lines. But the documentation is in. The connection to Aldous is established. If something comes of it, I'll be notified. And if nothing comes of it, then we still have a record, she said, which didn't exist before, and which may be useful to someone down the line, even if it's not useful now. Cole was looking at his cup. You weren't going to let it go, he said. No, she said. I wasn't. He was quiet. She did ask about you at supper, he said. Before the fire. Most nights. Isabella didn't say anything to that. I put that in the letter because she asked me to pass it along, he said, in the way of a man explaining something he knows is not exactly true. That's why I wrote it. I know that's why you wrote it, Isabella said. He looked up at her. She looked back at him, and they held that for a moment. The particular look of two people who have been honest with each other about most things and are now in the vicinity of something that would require honesty about more than practicalities. Then Cole looked back at his cup. The east fence needs 3 new sections by the end of the week, he said. Deacon could use another set of hands on the wire stretching. I know how to stretch wire, Isabella said. I know you do, he said. Deacon said you did it cleaner than Pete. He told me that too, she said. Cole stood, rinsed his cup, hung it on the hook. He picked up his hat. Good night, Miss Carter. Good night, Cole. He went out, and she sat alone in the kitchen that had become, in some way she hadn't planned for and couldn't entirely explain, the kitchen she thought of when she thought of kitchens. She finished her coffee. She looked at the hook by the window where the dried sage hung, which was almost down to nothing and would need replacing if anyone was going to use it, which was the kind of small, practical, unnecessary thought that meant she was already thinking about next week. She blew out the lamp and went to the room that was the same as before. Narrow bed, window overlooking the side yard, the hook on the door where she hung her coat. Her book was on the windowsill, exactly where Maisie had said it would be. She picked it up. She sat on the edge of the bed. Outside the window, the ranch was quiet in the way it got after dark. The particular silence of a place that has work to do in the morning and knows it. She could see the stars from the window, more than she'd ever seen in Kansas, more than seemed possible for one sky to hold. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but present, the way they always were once you'd learned to feel them. She sat there holding her mother's book in both hands, in a room she hadn't expected to be back in, on a ranch that belonged to a man who said the room was still here if she needed it, and she thought about the 40 acres of eastern boundary lot that no one had managed to get a title dispute filed against because she'd arrived, impossibly, wrongly, entirely by accident, at exactly the moment she had. The wrong destination, she thought. She thought about smoke, and children who miscalculate wind speed, and men who say practical things to avoid saying other things, and the particular weight of a child's arms around your middle in a kitchen that smells like coffee. She thought about Benjamin Hale, who had never existed, and what his non-existence had set in motion. Then she stopped thinking and lay back on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling, and let the silence of the ranch settle over her like something she'd earned the right to rest in, at least for tonight, at least for now. She was back on the fence line the next morning. Deacon handed her the wire stretcher without comment, same as the first time, and they worked in the cold autumn air, while the sky above the north pasture stayed pale and clear and gave no indication that anything had burned under it 4 days ago. The smell was still there, though, that particular scorched earth smell that doesn't leave quickly, something beneath the ordinary ranch smell of horses and dry grass and turned soil. It sat in the back of the throat and reminded you. The east fence took 3 days. 3 sections of new rail, new wire, 2 posts that had to be reset because the fire's heat had damaged the ground around them in a way that wasn't visible until you tried to drive a post and found the earth wrong underneath. Deacon knew how to fix it. He knew how to fix most things on this ranch, Isabella was coming to understand, in the quiet and unannounced way of someone who had simply been here long enough to learn everything. He reset the posts without making it a lesson. She watched and helped and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Cole worked alongside them for part of the second day. He didn't say much. He worked the way he did everything, steadily, without wasted motion, aware of what the job needed without having to announce it. At one point, they were both on the same section of wire, and their hands were close on the stretcher, and he didn't move his, and neither did she, and they just worked like that for a few minutes, which meant nothing except that it meant something. In the evenings, the house was different than it had been in her first stay. Not dramatically. Nothing about Cole Mercer was ever dramatic, but in small ways that accumulated. He left coffee on the stove in the mornings instead of making it fresh only for himself. He told Maisie to let Isabella look at a split in her boot sole that needed re-gluing before he'd mentioned it to any of the hands. When they sat at supper, he talked a little more. Not much, not speeches, but he told a story about the first winter he'd run the ranch alone after his father died. A bad winter, and how Deacon had shown up at the end of January with 3 weeks of supplies and a complete lack of interest in being thanked for it. He told it looking at the table. Isabella listened. Maisie had heard it before but listened again with the patience of a child who understands that some stories are being told for a different audience. Isabella stayed. She hadn't made a formal decision about it. She just kept being there, which, in the life of a working ranch, was its own kind of decision. She wrote to Ellsworth twice more during those 2 weeks. The prosecutor's interest had solidified into something more concrete. A meeting had been scheduled with a deputy marshal from the territorial office, who had jurisdiction over schemes that crossed county lines. Ellsworth's letter was careful about expectations. He did not use the word arrest. He did not suggest a timeline. But the language had changed from interest to active review, and that was not nothing. She wrote to Clara. Clara wrote back. The Laramie County clerk had requested her original letters for the territorial file. She was well. She had taken on 2 new alterations clients, and the work was steady. She had found, she wrote in her careful way, that the act of giving the statement had done something she hadn't expected. It had made the thing feel finished in a way it hadn't before. Not because the outcome was certain, but because she'd said what happened out loud, officially, to someone who wrote it down. It turns out, Clara wrote, that being believed matters more than I realized it would. Isabella read that line twice. She understood it exactly. It was Maisie who found the letter. She found it the way children find things, not looking for it, not expecting it, simply being in a place where something was, and picking it up because it was there. She'd been in the small storage room off the main bedroom. She'd gone in to look for a spare lamp chimney her father had asked about. And in the back of the bottom shelf, behind a rusted tin and a broken harness buckle that had apparently been waiting for repair since the previous administration, she'd found a cigar box. The cigar box contained a photograph, a woman with dark hair and a calm, direct expression, who looked enough like Maisie that you didn't need to be told who it was. 2 ribbon-tied bundles of letters, a child's drawing that had been folded and refolded many times, and at the bottom, separate from the rest and not sealed, a single sheet of paper in handwriting that was not Cole's. Maisie brought the box to her father. She handed it to him in the kitchen without saying anything, which was sometimes how Maisie communicated the most serious things. Cole looked at it, and something moved across his face. Not quite recognition, not quite surprise, something underneath both of those. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Storage room," Maisie said, "behind the tin with the broken things." Cole opened the box. He looked at the photograph for a moment. He set it aside gently. He picked up the single unfolded sheet, the one that wasn't with the others, and read it. Isabella was at the stove when this happened. She didn't read the letter. She kept her attention on the pan in front of her and made a point of not being in the conversation unless she was invited into it. She heard the paper. She heard Cole go very quiet in a different way than his usual quiet. "Pa?" Maisie said. "Give me a minute," he said. He read it again. Isabella could tell without looking that he read it twice. Then he set it on the table and stood very still, and the kitchen was quiet except for the stove. After a while he said, "Isabella." She turned. He was standing with both hands flat on the table and his head down slightly, not looking at the letter, just near it. "This is from Evelyn," he said. "My wife. She must have written it when she got sick. She didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't know this was here." Isabella waited. "She writes about Maisie," he said, "about what she hoped for Maisie. She says—" He paused. He picked up the letter and held it, not reading it aloud, just holding it like he was deciding something. Then he set it back down. "She says she hoped someone would come. After her. Someone who'd know how to be with a child the way she tried to be. Someone who'd, she says, hold the ordinary things in place. That's what she wrote." He looked up. She never said any of this to me. I didn't know she wrote this down. The kitchen was very still. Maisie was looking at the letter on the table with an expression that was complicated in the way that only a child's expressions can be, processing grief and something else simultaneously, something she didn't have a word for yet. "Can I read it?" Maisie asked. Cole looked at his daughter. He picked up the letter and handed it to her. Maisie read it. She read slowly, with the care of someone for whom reading was still partly physical. Her lips moved slightly. When she finished, she held it for a moment and then placed it back on the table with a deliberateness that looked like something her mother might have done. "She knew," Maisie said. "She hoped," Cole said. Maisie looked at Isabella. It was a long look, the particular long look of a child drawing a line between what was and what is. "She's not wrong," she said, "about the ordinary things." Isabella didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been too much or too little. Cole folded the letter. He put it back in the cigar box on top of the photograph, with a care that was almost formal. He closed the lid. "I'm going to finish the north fence post today, Mashtom," he said in the flat, task-oriented voice of a man reorienting himself to the world in front of him. He picked up the box. He went upstairs. Maisie sat at the table for a moment after he left. Then she looked at Isabella. "Are you going to leave again?" she said. Not accusatory, just the honest question of someone who wanted accurate information. "I don't know," Isabella said. "That's the same answer as before," Maisie said. "I know," Isabella said. "I'm sorry." Maisie accepted that with a small nod and went to find Wellington. The town of Stone Creek, 4 miles down the road from the ranch, smaller than Cedar Bluff by about half, had formed its first impression of Isabella the way small towns form first impressions of everything unusual, completely, quickly, and without asking too many questions. She'd been in town twice during her first stay, once for supplies and once with Cole on the errand that had confirmed Benjamin Hale didn't exist. People had noticed her then without engaging. Now, coming back after her weeks in Cedar Bluff and Laramie, she was something more specific. The woman who'd come on a false marriage arrangement, who'd gone to the sheriff, who'd come back after the fire. Towns like this had layers of knowing, and she'd moved through several of them. The postmistress, a woman named Helen Garza, who ran the post office out of the front room of her house, and clearly knew the contents of every letter that passed through it by some form of near-psychic inference, greeted Isabella by name on her first visit, and asked after Maisie before Isabella had said anything about the ranch. "She gave us a scare," Isabella said. "She gives Cole a scare every other week," Helen said, not without affection. "That child has her mother's confidence and her father's inability to calculate risk." "She calculated the risk," Isabella said. "She just had bad data." Helen looked at her over the counter with the appraising expression of a woman who has been reading people through their correspondence for 20 years. "You're staying then," she said. It was the way she said it. Not a question, not a statement exactly, just a fact being laid out for consideration. "I'm here for now," Isabella said. Helen handed her 3 letters, one from Ellsworth, one from Clara, one she didn't recognize the return address on, and said nothing further, which was its own kind of commentary. The unknown letter was from the deputy marshal's office in Cheyenne. It was short, 2 paragraphs, and it asked her to confirm her availability for a formal interview regarding the Meridian Holdings inquiry at a date to be arranged at a location convenient to her. It used language like material witness and pattern of fraudulent correspondence and territory-wide investigation. She stood outside the post office in the cold morning air and read it twice. Territory-wide. Not just a county inquiry, not just Ellsworth's careful cross-referencing. Something had shifted in the weight of it, the prosecutor's office passing it up, the territorial marshal taking it on. That meant there were more cases than she'd known about, more women, more properties. Enough of a pattern that someone with actual authority had decided it was worth the effort of doing something about it. She wrote back that afternoon confirming her availability and providing the Stone Creek Ranch address. That evening, she told Cole about it at supper. He listened the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, without redirecting, without making it about anything other than what she was saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Cheyenne's 4 days from here," he said. "I know." "When?" They'll set the date. Could be a few weeks. He nodded. He ate. After a moment, he said, I'll go with you. Isabella looked at him. You don't have to. The ranch address is in the filing, he said. They may want to speak to me anyway. And he paused, not long, but perceptibly. I know a man in Cheyenne. Land attorney. Good one. He should look at the Meridian Holdings title records before that interview. It was practical. It was entirely practical. And they both knew it was slightly more than that, and neither of them said so, which was its own kind of progress. All right, Isabella said. All right, Cole said. Maisie was looking back and forth between them with the alert, cataloging expression of a child who has learned that the most interesting information is often in what adults don't say. Can I come? She said. No, Cole and Isabella said, at the same moment, and then looked at each other. And Maisie sat back in her chair with a small, private smile that she did not entirely manage to conceal. The town did not exactly embrace Isabella because small towns don't embrace anything quickly. But it began, in the weeks after the fire, to adjust its arrangement around her presence. The woman who ran the dry goods store, a Mrs. Holt, whose first name Isabella never learned because apparently no one used it, began putting aside the bolt cloth she thought Isabella might need before she came in, which was either presumptuous or efficient, depending on how you looked at it. The doctor, who was also the dentist and who Isabella privately suspected would be the undertaker if the town needed one, stopped her on the street to ask about Maisie's boots. He'd heard about the near miss at the fire, he said, and just wanted to confirm the girl was in one piece. 2 women from the church at the end of the road came to the ranch with a preserves jar and an awkward warmth that meant they'd argued about coming and then come anyway. None of this was acceptance in any formal sense. It was something earlier than that. The town taking a measurement, comparing it against what it knew, revising slightly. Deacon told her one afternoon on the fence line that people in Stone Creek had been watching Cole for years and worrying about him in the way of people who respected a man enough not to say anything directly. He does everything right, Deacon said. Runs the ranch right, raises the girl right, handles his business right. But there was something tight, maybe. Like he was holding the whole thing together by force and not sure what would happen if he let up. He glanced at her sideways. It's looser now. Isabella didn't respond to that. Deacon didn't require a response. I'm just saying what I see, he said. I know, she said. You usually are. The night Cole found her sitting with Evelyn's letter was an accident. She hadn't taken it from the box. She would not have done that. She'd been in the kitchen late, unable to sleep, and the cigar box was on the shelf where Cole had placed it after he came back downstairs that afternoon. She wasn't looking at it. She was just sitting at the table with tea and a quiet that had turned thoughtful, and her eyes had landed on it. Cole came down the stairs at some point past midnight for water, the way he sometimes did. She'd heard him 2 or 3 times before, just the sound of footsteps and the well pump and footsteps back up. Tonight he came into the kitchen and found her there, and stopped. Couldn't sleep, she said. Same, he said. He filled his cup. He stood at the counter for a moment, and then, instead of going back upstairs, he sat down at the other end of the table. They were quiet. The lamp was low. The box was on the shelf between them, and they both knew it was there, and neither looked at it. She was practical, Cole said. Not out of nowhere. It was a continuation of something he'd been thinking, Isabella could tell. People sometimes didn't understand that about her. She was warm. She cared about people in a way that showed, but underneath it, she was practical. She thought things through. It sounds like Maisie, Isabella said. Maisie got the practical part and the confidence part, he said, still working on the thinking through part. She's 8. She is, he said. He turned his cup in his hands. Evelyn used to say that Maisie was going to be the kind of person the world needs more of, and that the world was going to have trouble with her for exactly that reason. He was almost smiling in the careful way of someone smiling at a memory they haven't let themselves use in a while. She was right about most things. That letter, Isabella said carefully. The one in the box. You don't have to explain it to me. I know I don't, he said. I want to. He set his cup down. She knew at the end that she wasn't going to get better. She didn't tell me that directly. She protected people, sometimes more than they needed, but she knew. And she wrote things down that she couldn't say. He looked at the table. I didn't know that letter existed. I don't know why she didn't give it to me. Maybe she thought it would. I don't know. Maybe it felt too certain, like saying it made it final. Isabella looked at him. He was looking at the table still, and she could see the shape of what it cost him to say any of this, how it sat in the muscles of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. She couldn't have known I'd come, Isabella said quietly. Not specifically. No, he said. She hoped. That's different. He looked up. But you did come, and you are. He stopped. He had the look of a man for whom the word he needed was available, but the act of saying it was requiring more than he'd prepared for. I know, Isabella said. Not to spare him, but because she did know. She'd known for a while. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not saying it was her doing, he said. I'm not saying the letter meant anything beyond what it was. A woman writing down what she hoped for in the middle of being afraid. But I've been sitting with it all day, and what I keep thinking is... He stopped again. He looked at her directly, the straightforward look that was his most honest mode of communication. You didn't have to come back from Laramie, after Cedar Bluff, after the fire. You had reasons to go elsewhere. Better situations, probably. More stable ones. Probably, Isabella said. But you didn't. No, she said. Why not? He said. Not a challenge. An actual question, asked plainly, the way he asked for things he actually wanted to know. Isabella looked at the lamp, the low, steady flame in the glass. She thought about the honest answer and all the ways to trim it into something safer, and decided against trimming. Because I kept thinking about this kitchen, she said, when I was in Cedar Bluff, when I was in Laramie, at the end of the day when I wasn't working anymore. I kept thinking about this kitchen, about Maisie and the flower cabinet and Wellington under the stove and you drinking coffee before dawn without feeling like you had to fill the silence. She paused. I've been in a lot of places that were adequate. I have not been in many places where I forgot to be ready to leave. Cole was very still. And that scared me, she said, because I came here for a man who didn't exist and I was not supposed to find anything worth staying for. That was not the plan. There was no plan, Cole said. I know, she said. That's what scared me. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp burned. The house was silent around them. I'm not easy to live with, he said. It was not false modesty. It was an actual inventory, delivered with the same directness he brought to everything. I don't talk enough. I work too long. I spend 2 weeks solving a problem before I tell anyone there is one. Evelyn used to say I communicated in fence posts. Everything load-bearing, nothing decorative. I've noticed, Isabella said. And Maisie is wonderful, Isabella said. She is also 8 years old and convinced she can calculate wind speed from first principles, and her boots are a disaster. I can work with that. Something in Cole's expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, or not only that, something quieter and more settled. You've thought about this, he said. I have had quite a lot of time to think about things, she said. 2 months of traveling and waiting and not knowing where I was going will do that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said simply, I don't want you to leave. It was the most direct thing he had ever said that wasn't about fences or schedules, and he said it in the same tone he said those things, which was exactly right. I'm not planning to, Isabella said. He nodded once. He picked up his cup. He stood. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said. He went back up the stairs. Isabella sat in the kitchen with the low lamp and the box on the shelf, and the particular quiet of a house where something has been said that needed saying and has settled into its proper place. And she sat there until she was genuinely tired, and then she went to bed. 2 weeks later, Cole's land attorney in Cheyenne sent a letter that changed the practical situation considerably. He had reviewed the Meridian Holdings records at Ellsworth's request and found something that Ellsworth, good as he was, had not thought to look for. A deed covenant on the eastern boundary lot, the 40 acres Cole had mentioned, that had been filed 18 months ago under a name that appeared to be a Meridian Holdings subsidiary. It was a fraudulent filing, almost certainly, but it existed. And its existence meant that Cole's title to that parcel was technically clouded until the filing was challenged. Cole read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with Isabella and Maisie both present. Maisie because it was before school and she was eating and had not yet been redirected. Isabella because Cole had handed it to her without preamble, which meant he wanted her to read it. They did file, Isabella said. They just did it quietly enough that it didn't show up in the initial search. 18 months ago, Cole said, which means they were already working this property when the letters were sent to me, Isabella said. I wasn't just useful cover. This specific ranch was a target. They filed against the lot first, then sent me here to show up and create more noise. She set the letter down. That's actually better for the case. Cole looked at her. How is that better? Because it's documentable intent, she said. Not just a pattern across multiple properties. A specific sequence of actions targeted at a specific parcel. That's harder to argue as coincidence. She paused. I need to write to Ellsworth today. I'll write to the attorney, Cole said. Tell him I want to be in Cheyenne for the marshal's interview before the month is out, she said. The sooner the deed challenge is filed alongside the fraud documentation, the cleaner the case looks. Maisie was looking between them again with her cataloging expression. You sound like you work together, she said. Cole and Isabella both looked at her. I mean, the way you talk, Maisie said, unabashed. Like the ranch. When things need doing, you just divide them up without arguing about it. That's how work gets done, Isabella said. I know, Maisie said. Pa and Deacon do it too, but it's different with you two. She seemed to decide that was sufficient observation and went back to her breakfast. Cole was looking at the letter. The corner of his mouth was doing something that was not quite a smile and not quite not one. She's not wrong, he said quietly to the letter. She usually isn't, Isabella said, and went to find paper. The day before they left for Cheyenne, Isabella went into the storage room. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was checking the lamp supply. They were going to need someone to manage the house in their absence, and she was making an inventory. But she stood in the storage room for a moment, looking at the empty shelf where the cigar box had been, the rusted tin, the broken harness buckle that was still waiting. She thought about Evelyn Mercer, who had been practical and warm and had written a letter she couldn't say out loud and put it somewhere she must have known would eventually be found. She thought about what it meant to hope for something specific for the people you loved and to have the courage to write it down, even when you wouldn't be there to see whether it came true. She didn't know Evelyn. She would never know her. But she thought she understood something about the impulse, the need to extend your care past the edges of your own time, to set something down that might do work you couldn't do yourself. The broken harness buckle was fixable, she noticed. It was a simple break. The pin had sheared off, but the body of the buckle was intact. She picked it up and took it to the kitchen and put it on the counter next to a note that said, Deacon, this can be repaired. Small replacement pin, worth fixing. She added it to the list of things that needed doing. Then she finished the inventory, packed her bag for Cheyenne, and went out to help Cole load the wagon for the morning. The wagon left Stone Creek before first light. Cole drove and Isabella sat beside him on the bench with a blanket across her lap because the pre-dawn cold in October was not a suggestion, it was a condition, and the 4-day journey to Cheyenne was going to require treating it seriously. Maisie had been awake to see them off despite being told specifically not to be. She'd appeared in the yard in her coat over her nightgown, hair unbraided, holding Wellington with the air of someone who had decided the rule about bedtime did not apply to significant departures. Don't let Pete near the east fence, Cole told her. I know, Maisie said. Deacon's in charge. I know, Pa. Cole looked at her for a moment in the way he looked at things he was reluctant to leave. Then he clicked the horse forward and the wagon moved, and Maisie stood in the yard watching them go until the dark swallowed the distance between them. They rode in silence for the first hour, the way they were comfortable doing. The land around them was barely visible in the darkness. Shapes more than details, the suggestion of the mountains to the west, the pale strip of road ahead. Isabella sat with her hands inside the blanket and thought about the marshal's office and what she needed to say and how to say it plainly without either overstating what she knew or underselling what the document showed. After a while, Cole said, You nervous? About the interview? She considered it honestly. A little. Not about the questions, about whether it will matter. Ellsworth thinks it will. Ellsworth is careful and thorough, and I trust his reading of the documentation, Isabella said. But prosecutors make choices about what to pursue. Territorial marshals have limited resources. I've built the best case I can from where I stood, and now it goes somewhere I can't control. She paused. That's the part I'm not good at. The part where you've done what you can do, and then you have to let it be what it is. Cole was quiet for a moment. The horse moved steadily on the dark road. Same as ranching, he said. Is it? You do the work. You fix what you can fix. Then the weather comes and does what it does, and you find out what held. He said it matter-of-factly, not as consolation, but as observation. Doesn't mean the work was wrong, just means it's not the only factor. Isabella thought about that. That's a very particular kind of patience, she said. It's the only kind that works out here, he said. The sky began to lighten somewhere around the second hour, the dark going gray and then pale at the eastern edge, the mountains coming clear to the west in the strengthening light. Isabella watched it happen the way she'd watched it from the kitchen window of Stone Creek Ranch. The world reassembling itself from darkness in the specific order it always used, which was not comfort exactly, but was something related to it. Cheyenne was 4 days of travel in a different world. Not in the way of a city back east. It was still a frontier town at its core, built around the railroad and the cattle trade and the particular commerce of a territorial capital. But it was larger than anything Isabella had been in since leaving Kansas, and louder, and full of the specific energy of a place where a great deal of money moved in a great many directions, and a significant portion of the people on the street were there to get some of it. They stayed at a boarding house near the courthouse district, 2 rooms, separate. Mrs. Fenwick, who ran it, asking no questions beyond the length of their stay and whether they required meals included. They required meals included. She fed them adequately and without apparent curiosity about their business, which was the kind of boarding house you wanted when your business was what theirs was. Cole went to see his land attorney, a man named Hargrove, the morning after they arrived. Isabella went to find Ellsworth's colleague, a court clerk named Adler, who had been corresponding with Ellsworth and who had their interview scheduled for the following day with Deputy Marshal Raines. Adler was a precise, bespectacled man who had organized their documentation into a file that was, Isabella noted with genuine appreciation, considerably more thorough than she'd expected. He had taken Ellsworth's cross-referencing and extended it, 6 properties now confirmed as connected to Meridian Holdings filings, 8 women he'd been able to trace through various county records, some of whom had filed complaints with local sheriffs that had gone nowhere because each individual complaint hadn't been connected to the others. Until now, Isabella said. Until now, Adler confirmed. He placed the file on the desk between them. What you and Miss Marsh did, bringing the letters in, providing statements, connecting the pattern, that's what allowed the marshal's office to treat this as a territory-wide operation, rather than a series of unrelated civil matters. He paused. It may not seem like much from where you stood, but from a legal standpoint, that documentation is the reason this has moved from a county sheriff's interest to a deputy marshal's active inquiry. Isabella looked at the file. 8 women, 6 properties. A man named Victor Aldis, who had moved through all of it, leaving careful, deniable footprints. Where is he now? She said. That, Adler said, is what Marshal Raines will tell you tomorrow. Deputy Marshal Raines was a tall woman in her 40s with iron-gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing a difficult job long enough to know that urgency and speed were not the same thing. She shook Isabella's hand when she came into the office, shook Cole's, gestured them both to chairs across the desk from her, and opened her own copy of the file without preamble. You came a long way for this, she said to Isabella. I came a long way before I knew this was what I was coming for, Isabella said. The rest was just finishing the journey. Raines looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality of someone whose job required accurate readings of people. Then she looked at the file. Victor Aldis, she said, I'm going to tell you where we are, and I'm going to be direct about what that means and doesn't mean. Please, Isabella said. Aldis was located in Denver 6 weeks ago. He is currently in custody there on a separate fraud charge, a land investment scheme targeting Denver businessmen that has nothing to do with the Wyoming operation, but which gave the Colorado Marshals enough to hold him. She turned a page. We have been in contact with the Colorado office. The documentation you and Miss Marsh provided, combined with the deed filings Hargrove identified on the Stone Creek parcel and 4 others, has given us sufficient basis to file federal fraud charges under the territory's jurisdiction. She looked up. He will not walk away from this cleanly. I want to be honest with you that the legal process will be slow. These things are. Months, possibly more than a year. But the case is real, and it is moving. Isabella sat very still. She was aware of Cole beside her, not touching her, just present in the reliable way he was present. "The women," she said. "The others. We've made contact with 5 of the 8. All 5 have been informed. 2 have agreed to provide statements. The others," Rains paused. "Some of them have moved on and don't wish to re-engage with it. That's their right. What you provided is sufficient to build the federal case regardless of how many additional witnesses come forward." "Clara Marsh," Isabella said. "She should be notified directly. She's the one who kept her letters." "She's already been contacted," Rains said. "She was the first call I made after reviewing the file." Isabella let out a breath. It was not relief exactly. The verdict wasn't in. Aldous was still only in custody on a separate charge. The process was going to be exactly as slow and imperfect as Rains had described. But something had closed. A door she'd been holding open with her shoulder for 2 months had found its frame. "The deed filing on the Stone Creek Eastern lot," Cole said. He'd been quiet until now, which was his way, listening until he had something specific to say. "Hargrove filed the challenge yesterday. How long does the cloud on title remain during federal proceedings?" Rains looked at him. "Hargrove's a good attorney. If the challenge is filed cleanly alongside the fraud documentation, the cloud should lift within 60 days. The fraudulent filing will be invalidated as part of the federal case record." She paused. "Your 40 acres will be clear." Cole nodded once. It was the nod of a man who has been waiting for one specific piece of information and has now received it and is filing it away. They left the marshal's office an hour later into a Cheyenne afternoon that was cold and clear and going about its business the way cities do, regardless of what has just been resolved inside their buildings. Isabella stood on the boardwalk outside, and Cole stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he said. "It might not end the way it should. He might negotiate something reduced. The process might drag long enough that the evidence gets complicated." "I know," Cole said. I'm not saying it didn't matter. I know it mattered." She looked at the street. "I just want to be accurate about what it is." "You don't have to talk yourself out of feeling like something went right," Cole said. She looked at him. "Something went right," he said. "You can let that be true without also needing it to be complete." Isabella was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them. Horses, wagons, people with their own business and their own private reckonings. She thought about a woman in Ohio who had answered a letter and lost months of her life to a scheme she'd had no way to detect. She thought about 7 other women whose names she'd never know. She thought about the long, careful work of Ellsworth and Adler and Pruitt, all the incremental, ordinary labor of people who believed that documentation mattered, even when outcomes were uncertain. She thought about her own letters, folded in her coat pocket the night she'd stood on the road outside Stone Creek Ranch with the stagecoach already gone. She'd carried them across 2 months and 4 towns, and she still had them. She would keep them, she'd decided, not as a wound, as a record. Evidence that something had happened, that it had mattered, that she'd done something about it. "All right," she said. "Something went right." Cole said nothing else. He just stood there in the way that meant he was staying, which was enough. They rode back to Stone Creek over 4 days, the return trip quieter than the going out, the way return trips tend to be when the weight of anticipation has been replaced by the simpler weight of knowing. The weather held, cold, clear, the sky that Wyoming blue, that had no equivalent in Kansas, and that Isabella had stopped trying to describe to herself and simply accepted as the color of here. On the second evening, they stopped at a roadhouse for the night, a low building with 3 rooms to let, and a common table for supper where they ate alongside 2 traveling merchants and an older rancher going home from somewhere. The rancher talked about winter coming early and what that meant for the spring calving, and Cole talked back with the easy knowledge of someone who had been reading this landscape for 40 years of living in it. And Isabella sat between them and listened and felt something she recognized as comfort. Not the comfort of ease, but the comfort of being in a place where she understood the language, where the conversation made sense to her, where she had something to add when she chose to. On the third night, camped because the next roadhouse was too far, and the weather was still holding, they sat by the fire and were quiet in the way that had become natural between them. Not absence of words, but the presence of something that didn't require them. The stars were extraordinary, the way they always were out here, the kind of sky that made a person feel both very small and very specifically located. "I need to tell you something," Cole said. Isabella waited. "I went into the storage room last week," he said. He was looking at the fire. "Before Cheyenne. I was looking for the spare lamp chimney, same as Maisie, and I found—" He stopped. There was another box, behind the shelf, smaller. He reached into his coat and took out something she hadn't seen before. A small folded paper, the kind of small that comes from something being refolded many times over years. He held it for a moment without opening it. "It's not a letter," he said. "It's a drawing. Maisie made it when she was 5, I think. She gave it to me and I put it somewhere and then I forgot where and she asked about it once and I had to tell her I'd misplaced it." He paused. "She wasn't angry. She's never angry about things like that. She put her hand on my arm and said it was all right." He turned the folded paper in his hands. "I've been carrying this around since I found it. I don't know what to do with it." Isabella looked at him. In the firelight, he looked like what he was. A man who had been holding a ranch and a daughter and a grief together for 4 years through the force of being the kind of man who did not let things fall and who was very tired of doing it entirely alone. "You give it back to her," Isabella said quietly. "You tell her you found it. She'll be glad." "I told her I misplaced it," he said. "Tell her you found it where you misplaced it," Isabella said. "She's 8. She won't require more than that." He was quiet for a moment, then he almost smiled, that careful, infrequent thing that changed his whole face. "You know her pretty well," he said. "I've had time to pay attention," Isabella said. He folded the paper back into his pocket. He looked at the fire. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer honestly, not to protect me from anything, just honestly." "All right," she said. "When you're in the kitchen in the mornings," he said, "and I come down and you've already got the fire going and the coffee on, do you do that because it's what needs doing, or do you do it because it's your kitchen?" Isabella looked at the fire for a moment. It was, she thought, the most accurate question anyone had asked her in years. Not about obligation, not about arrangement, not about what made practical sense. About something underneath all of that. About how you know when a place has moved from somewhere you're staying to somewhere you live. "Both," she said. "At first it was because it needed doing. Now it's both." Cole was quiet. The fire crackled. The horses moved in the dark at the edge of the camp. "I want to marry you," he said. He said it in his plainest voice, the voice he used for things that mattered and didn't require decoration. Not because of Maisie, not because of the ranch, not because of the situation, because I want to. Because I've been watching you for 2 months now, and I know how you think, and I know what you're like when something is wrong, and I know what you're like when something goes right, and I'd rather have you there for both of those things than not." Isabella sat with that for a moment. The fire was warm against her face. The night was cold at her back, and the sky above was enormous and full of stars that had been there long before either of them, and would be there long after. She thought about a letter from a man who didn't exist. She thought about how the thing that had looked like the worst possible beginning had turned out to be the only route to here. She thought about the difference between a life you plan and a life you build in the material you actually have, which is always different from what you imagined and sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, better. "Yes," she said. Cole looked at her, the careful, direct look. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. He nodded once, in the way he received things that mattered, with the full weight of it, without deflecting. Then he reached over and put his hand over hers, and they sat like that by the fire while Wyoming spread out enormous and dark around them, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. They came home to Stone Creek on a Thursday, late afternoon, the light going golden across the pasture in the way it did in October, when the angle of the sun was just right. The ranch looked the way it always looked, work-worn and real and requiring something, always requiring something, the east fence needing attention somewhere, even after they'd just fixed 3 sections, the barn that wasn't rebuilt yet throwing a long shadow across the yard. Maisie was in the yard before the wagon stopped. She appeared from the direction of the barn at a pace that was technically not running, but was absolutely running by any reasonable standard, and she pulled up short about 5 feet from the wagon with the self-control of someone who had decided she was too old to run at things, but whose body had not fully accepted the decision. "You're back," she said. "We're back," Cole said. "Cole." Maisie looked at Isabella. She looked at Cole. She looked at the way they'd come down from the wagon, Cole offering a hand and Isabella taking it, not because she needed the help, but because it was offered, and that meant something. And Maisie's face did several things in rapid succession, which was rare for Maisie, who usually managed her expressions the way her father managed fence lines. "Did something happen?" she said. "Several things," Cole said. "Important things?" "Yes." Maisie looked at Isabella directly. "Are you staying?" she said. Not for a while." "Are you staying?" Isabella looked at this child, this 8-year-old who had calculated wind speed and gotten it wrong and named a cat Wellington and written letters to a stranger because it felt like the right thing to do, who had her mother's warmth and her father's exactness and her own particular brand of courage that didn't look like courage until you saw it up close, and felt for the second time the thing she didn't have a clean word for. It was cleaner now than the first time. It was simply love. "Yes," Isabella said. "I'm staying." Maisie's controlled expression held for exactly 2 more seconds. Then she crossed the remaining 5 feet and put her arms around Isabella's middle for the second time. And this time, Isabella didn't have to wait to respond. She held on immediately, her chin at the top of Maisie's head, her eyes on the mountains above the fence line that were lit gold pink in the declining sun. Cole stood beside them in the yard, looking at the ranch the way he looked at things he'd been worried about and found intact. After a moment, he put his hand on Maisie's shoulder, briefly, and then went to take the horse to the barn, because work was work and the horse still needed unhitching. And that was also what it meant to be home. Some things resolved cleanly and some things didn't, and that was the honest accounting of it. Victor Aldis was charged federally 8 months after the Cheyenne interview. The process took 14 months in total. Raines had been right about slow. And the outcome was a conviction on 3 of the 5 counts, which was not everything but was not nothing. 2 of the deed filings were invalidated by court order, including the one on Stone Creek's eastern boundary lot, which became officially and permanently Cole's 40 acres on a cold March morning when the paperwork arrived in the mail and he read it at the kitchen table without particular ceremony and put it in the file box where he kept important documents. Clara Marsh testified. She came to Cheyenne for the proceeding with her letters in a box and gave her statement in a clear, steady voice. And Isabella was there with her in the courthouse corridor beforehand, and they sat together on the hard bench the way you sit beside someone when you've been through something with them and there's nothing left to say about it, but you stay anyway. "Are you all right?" Isabella asked. "I will be," Clara said. "That's different from yes, but it's true." "It is," Isabella said. Clara looked at her hands. "I keep thinking about all the women we never found," she said. "The ones who didn't keep their letters, the ones who went somewhere and couldn't come back from it." "I think about them too," Isabella said. "Is there anything—" "I wrote to Pruitt about it," Isabella said, "and to a woman in Laramie who works with the county clerk's office. The documentation is part of the public record now. If other women come forward, even years from now, there's something to connect their cases to." She paused. "That's not enough." "I know it's not enough." "But it's more than there was," Clara said. "Yes," Isabella said. "More than there was." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened on the bench and smoothed her coat and said, "Tell me about the wedding," which was the first time she'd asked, and Isabella told her because it was a thing worth talking about. They married in the spring. Not a large occasion. The minister from Stone Creek, Deacon and Pete as witnesses, Helen Garza from the post office because she had found out before anyone told her, which was how Helen Garza found out about everything, and 2 women from town who had brought preserves that autumn and who arrived with a pie this time. Maisie stood beside Isabella in a dress that was finally the right length, and she held Wellington, who attended with dignity. The ceremony was short. Cole said his part in the plain, direct way he said everything that mattered. Isabella said hers. They signed the register. Afterward, in the kitchen, because that was where things happened in this house, Maisie sat on the counter with her pie plate and watched the adults with the satisfied expression of someone whose calculations had finally come out correct. "I knew you'd stay," she said to Isabella. "You didn't know," Isabella said. You hoped. I knew, Maisie said, with complete serenity. Cole was at the stove, filling coffee cups, and he said nothing but his shoulders did the thing they did when he was trying not to smile, which was its own kind of language. Deacon, leaning against the wall with his own plate, said, She's right, for what it's worth. I knew, too. Nobody knew, Isabella said. I didn't know. That's different from nobody knowing, Maisie said. There was no winning this argument, and Isabella knew it, and she didn't especially want to win it. What Isabella understood now, what 2 years in Wyoming had taught her in the way that only living somewhere teaches you, was that belonging was not a thing you found. It was not waiting at a destination. It was not contained in a letter. It was not promised by any arrangement. It was built. Badly at first, usually. With wrong materials and incomplete information and a significant number of errors that you had to go back and fix after the fact. She had come west for a man who didn't exist. She had arrived at the wrong ranch, with the wrong name in her pocket, with no way back and no plan forward. She had unpacked because she was the kind of person who couldn't live out of a bag, and that small, stubborn act of claiming a space she hadn't been given had been, in retrospect, the first real decision of her life in this place. The practical thing and the true thing had turned out to be the same thing, which she had not expected. She'd always thought of practicality as a substitute for what you actually wanted, what you settled for when the real thing wasn't available. She'd been wrong about that. The practical thing, done with full attention and genuine care, was often the real thing. The coffee made before dawn, the fence wire pulled clean, the letter written to a child about an orange kitten under a stove, the statements given to clerks who wrote things down. Small acts, accumulated. That was what a life was made of, and the making was the thing, not the arriving. She was in the kitchen on a morning in May when this became not a thought, but a fact she simply lived in. The stove lit, the coffee on, the mountains visible from the window in the clear morning air, Cole's boots on the stairs coming down, Maisie's voice from upstairs arguing with Wellington about something that could not have been a real argument, but sounded serious. Outside the window, the east pasture was green in a way it hadn't been when she arrived in October. The fire's damage grown over, not invisible. You could still see where the burn line had been if you knew to look, but alive again, green and going about its business. Cole came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee and stood at the other end of the counter, and she didn't turn around because she didn't need to, and he didn't say good morning because he didn't need to either. After a moment he said, East fence. I know, she said. Third post from the tree. Deacon saw it yesterday. I saw it this morning, she said. It can wait until after the calving check. He drank his coffee. Maisie has school. I told her last night. Isabella turned from the window. She's already dressed. She's just fighting with the cat about the sleeping arrangements. Cole looked at her. The plain, direct look that had unsettled her the first time she'd received it and now felt as familiar as the mountains. Something you'd stopped noticing only because it was always there. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. Maisie came down the stairs with Wellington tucked under one arm and her school books under the other, her hair braided with the improved technique of someone who had been practicing, and she moved through the kitchen with the ease of a child who knew every inch of it, who knew where the flour was kept and which floorboard creaked and the exact distance from the stove to the table, because this was her kitchen in the way that kitchens belong to the people who live in them. Wellington thinks he should stay home, Maisie announced. Wellington's opinion on scheduling is noted, Isabella said. He's very serious about it. He's very serious about everything, Cole said. It's in his nature. Maisie deposited Wellington on his customary chair and kissed Isabella on the cheek. She'd started doing this sometime in March, without announcement, and had continued without interruption, and went out the back door toward the road, and her footsteps crossed the yard and faded into the ordinary sounds of the morning. Cole set his cup down and picked up his hat. I'll look at the fence post before the calving check, he said. I'll come, she said. He nodded. He went out. Isabella stood in the kitchen for a moment, the coffee on the stove, the mountains in the window, the cat occupying his chair with presidential gravity, the sounds of the ranch starting up around the house in the way it started up every morning, reliable and ongoing and asking to be met. She thought about a woman in Kansas who had packed a bag and a set of letters and gotten on a coach going west, certain she knew where she was going and entirely wrong about it. She thought about that woman with something that wasn't pity and wasn't quite tenderness, something more like recognition. That woman had been practical and alone and had trusted the wrong thing in the right direction, which was more than nothing. She had gotten on the coach. She had walked through the gate. She had unpacked the wrong destination, she thought, for the last time. Not wrong. Early. She poured the second cup of coffee, put on her coat, and went out to find her husband at the fence line.